June 1941. German newsreels show unstoppable armored columns crushing everything before them, triumphant soldiers waving from tanks, a machine of conquest that seemed invincible. Now listen to this, a letter written just 6 months later from Oberjefreiter Hans Schmidt to his wife in Bavaria. Quote, "I cannot describe the cold. My feet are black. Yesterday we burned furniture from a village just to keep 3 men alive through the night. The horses are dead. We eat them. No one speaks of victory anymore." End quote. That letter, preserved in the German history, in documents and images archive maintained by the German Historical Institute, tells a different story than the propaganda films. How did the most powerful military force ever assembled by Nazi Germany go from absolute confidence to frozen desperation in less than a year? How did 3.5 million men invade the Soviet Union expecting to be home by Christmas, and instead find themselves in a meat grinder that would consume over 4 million German casualties by war's end? And what did those men actually experience, not in the sanitized heroic narrative fed to families back home, but in the reality of frostbite, starvation, industrial-scale slaughter, and complicity in genocide? This is the story of the Eastern Front told through the words of the men who fought there, the historians who have spent decades piecing together what actually happened, and the uncomfortable truth that suffering and criminality existed in the same army at the same time. We're going to examine how Wehrmacht soldiers went from invaders to victims of their own leadership's catastrophic miscalculations, and how that journey forced them to confront not just military defeat, but moral collapse. Operation Barbarossa launched on June 22, 1941, with the largest invasion force in human history. According to data compiled by the National World War II Museum, 3.8 million Axis troops crossed into Soviet territory along an 1,800-mile front, supported by 3,000 tanks, 7,000 artillery pieces, and 2,500 aircraft. The invasion plan divided German forces into 3 army groups, north pushing toward Leningrad, center driving for Moscow, and south targeting Ukraine and the industrial regions. In those first weeks, the advance seemed unstoppable. Army Group Center under Field Marshal Fedor von Bock encircled entire Soviet armies at Minsk and Smolensk. The Wehrmacht took over 300,000 prisoners at Minsk alone. Soldiers wrote home with genuine enthusiasm. One private, whose letter is preserved in Gunter Fuchs's compilation Letters from the Eastern Front published by Warfare History Network, wrote in early July, "We advance 30 kilometers each day. The Russians flee before us. Their equipment is primitive. We will be in Moscow within weeks, and this war will be over before autumn." That confidence wasn't just propaganda-induced delusion. It was based on doctrine that had worked spectacularly in Poland and France. Blitzkrieg, the integration of armor, infantry, and air power into fast-moving penetrations that bypassed strong points and encircled defenders, had proven devastatingly effective. German tactical proficiency at the small unit level remained superior to Soviet forces throughout 1941. The Red Army was still reeling from Stalin's purges of the officer corps, which had executed or imprisoned thousands of experienced commanders between 1937 and 1939. Soviet tactical coordination was poor, communication systems were inadequate, and many units were equipped with obsolete weapons. But the invasion was also ideologically driven in ways that would shape everything that followed. This wasn't a conventional war for territory. It was a war of annihilation premised on Nazi racial ideology. According to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum's article on German soldiers and the Holocaust, Wehrmacht leadership issued explicit criminal orders before the invasion began. The Commissar order dictated that Soviet political officers were to be shot upon capture, not treated as prisoners of war. The Barbarossa Decree granted German soldiers immunity from prosecution for crimes against Soviet civilians. The Hunger Plan deliberately calculated that millions of Soviet citizens would be starved to feed German forces and the German home front. This genocidal framework was communicated down through the ranks. Soldiers received ideological indoctrination, portraying the Soviet Union as a Jewish Bolshevik menace, Slavic populations as subhuman, and the conflict as existential. The USHMM documentation makes clear that this wasn't just SS policy. The Wehrmacht itself distributed propaganda materials and briefings that dehumanized the enemy and normalized atrocity. We need to establish this context early because the story of soldiers suffering on the Eastern Front cannot be separated from the criminal war they were waging. They were simultaneously perpetrators and victims, and understanding their experience requires holding both realities at once. By late July 1941, the advance began to slow. Not because of Soviet military effectiveness, the Red Army was still suffering catastrophic defeats, but because of something the German High Command had catastrophically underestimated. Logistics. The term sounds abstract until you understand what it meant on the ground. According to military historian David Stahel's research on Operation Barbarossa, German planning assumed a 6 to 8 week campaign. Supply calculations were based on that timeline. But even as the Wehrmacht raced forward, the infrastructure couldn't keep up. Soviet railways used a different gauge than European railways, requiring time-consuming conversion or transloading of supplies at the border. The road network in the Western Soviet Union was primitive, mostly unpaved tracks that turned to impassable mud in rain. Partisan activity, encouraged by Stalin's scorched earth orders, interdicted supply columns. German trucks, designed for European roads, broke down at alarming rates on Soviet terrain. By August, some frontline units were receiving less than a third of their required daily supplies. Listen to how this appeared in soldier accounts. A letter from Corporal Wilhelm Hoffmann, stationed with the 267th Infantry Division, written in August 1941 and preserved in the Fuchs collection states. We have been marching for 6 weeks. My boots are held together with wire. We receive 1 meal every 2 days. The horses are dying faster than we can eat them. When we capture a village, the men fight over potatoes like animals. This is not what we were promised. End quote. The Wehrmacht was experiencing what military theorists call culmination point, the moment when an offensive force has advanced so far beyond its supply base that it can no longer sustain combat operations. But Hitler and the High Command refused to acknowledge this reality. Instead of consolidating gains and establishing supply lines, they pushed forward. In September 1941, Hitler diverted Army Group Center's panzer forces south to complete the encirclement of Kiev, taking over 600,000 Soviet prisoners, but delaying the advance on Moscow until late autumn. That decision would prove catastrophic. By the time Operation Typhoon, the assault on Moscow, launched in early October 1941, the weather had changed. Autumn rains turned the primitive roads into mud so deep that vehicles couldn't move. The Rasputitsa, the season of mud, immobilized entire divisions. Then in early November, the temperature dropped. Winter arrived weeks earlier than German planners had anticipated and with a severity they hadn't prepared for. According to meteorological records, temperatures around Moscow reached -20 Celsius by mid-November and would drop to -40 Celsius in December. The German army was not equipped for winter warfare. This wasn't an oversight, it was a calculated gamble based on the assumption that the Soviet Union would collapse before winter. Soldiers had standard uniforms, not insulated winter gear. Vehicles had no antifreeze. Weapons were not treated with cold weather lubricants. The logistical system had prioritized ammunition and fuel over winter clothing. Even if winter supplies had been prepared, the broken supply network couldn't have delivered them to frontline units. The physical toll was immediate and devastating. A medical officer named Dr. Heinrich Hopp, whose diary was published in the compilation The German Soldier in World War II, described treatment stations overflowing with frostbite cases. Quote, "The men arrive with feet swollen black, frozen solid inside their boots. We amputate toes, then feet, then legs. There is no anesthetic. They scream or they are silent. There is no pattern." One man lost both legs and asked only for a cigarette. Another lost 3 toes and sobbed for his mother until he died of shock. End quote. According to German Army medical records analyzed by historian Omer Bartov, the Wehrmacht suffered over 100,000 frostbite casualties in December 1941 alone. Entire divisions lost combat effectiveness not from enemy action but from the cold. Equipment failed across the board. Tank engines wouldn't start. Artillery recoil mechanisms froze solid. Rifles jammed. Supply trucks couldn't move. The technological superiority that had powered the Blitzkrieg victories became irrelevant when the machines simply stopped working. And the Red Army counterattacked. On December 5, 1941, Soviet forces under General Georgy Zhukov launched a massive offensive around Moscow using fresh divisions brought from Siberia, troops equipped and trained for winter combat. The Wehrmacht, exhausted and frozen, was pushed back. This was the first major German defeat of the war. The psychological impact cannot be overstated. Soldiers who had been told they were fighting an inferior enemy, who had advanced hundreds of kilometers in months, who expected to be celebrating victory in Moscow, were instead retreating through blizzards, abandoning equipment, and dying in the snow. A lieutenant named Gottfried Futz, no relation to the compiler, wrote in his diary in December 1941, "We are no longer an army. We are ghosts walking through hell. I have not felt my feet in 3 days. We shoot our wounded rather than leave them to freeze. God has abandoned us here." This passage appears in the German History and Documents and Images database maintained by the GHI. The failure to take Moscow marked a strategic breaking point. Germany was now locked into a war of attrition against an enemy with vastly greater population and resources fighting on interior supply lines. The quick victory scenario was dead, but the Nazi leadership, Hitler especially, refused to adjust strategy. Instead, they doubled down. The summer 1942 offensive would focus on southern objectives, driving toward the oil fields of the Caucasus and the industrial city of Stalingrad. Stalingrad, the name became synonymous with destruction. According to the National World War II Museum's comprehensive article on the battle, fighting began in August 1942 when German Sixth Army under General Friedrich Paulus reached the Volga River. Hitler ordered the city taken for symbolic reasons. It bore Stalin's name, even though militarily it would have made more sense to bypass and isolate it. What followed was urban warfare at an intensity unprecedented in human history. The museum's research documents that fighting occurred building by building, room by room, sometimes floor by floor in the same structure. Soviet defenders used the rubble to their advantage, turning factory complexes into fortresses. German advantages in artillery and air power became less relevant in close quarters. Casualties on both sides were staggering. The Soviets fed reinforcements across the Volga under constant German fire, accepting horrific losses to maintain defensive lines. Historian Antony Beevor, whose book Stalingrad remains the definitive English-language account, describes the combat environment as Rattenkrieg, rat war, fighting in sewers and basements and burned-out buildings where soldiers might not see the sky for days. Life expectancy for a Soviet private in Stalingrad was less than 24 hours. German casualty rates were only marginally better. A letter from Jeffreiter Hans Metzger of the 24th Panzer Division, dated October 1942, states, "We fight for a single building for 2 weeks. We take it. We lose it. We take it again. I no longer know how many of my company are dead. I no longer know their names. We are not humans anymore." This letter is preserved in the Letters from the Eastern Front collection. By November 1942, German forces controlled 90% of Stalingrad, but the Soviets held on to narrow strips along the Volga. The Wehrmacht was exhausted, under strength, and fixed in place. Then the Soviets sprang the trap. On November 19, 1942, Operation Uranus launched simultaneous attacks north and south of Stalingrad, targeting the weaker Romanian armies protecting the German flanks. Within 4 days, Soviet pincers met at Kalach, encircling the entire Sixth Army, approximately 290,000 men. Hitler ordered Paulus to hold position and promised air supply and relief. Both promises proved empty. The Luftwaffe couldn't deliver a fraction of the required daily supplies in winter conditions over contested airspace. The relief attempt by Army Group Don under Field Marshal Erich von Manstein got within 30 miles of the pocket before stalling in late December. Inside the Kessel, the cauldron as German troops called the encirclement, conditions deteriorated with nightmare speed. According to Beevor's research, daily rations dropped to 1/6 of normal by late December. Horses were slaughtered and eaten, men boiled leather belts for soup, medical supplies vanished, wounded died untreated in the snow. The letters from Stalingrad survivors are almost unbearable to read. An officer whose diary Beevor quotes, Wilhelm Hoffmann, different from the earlier Wilhelm mentioned, wrote on January 1, 1943, "The horses have all been eaten. The men are eating pieces of cloth that have been soaked in horse blood. The temperature is -30. There is no hope of relief. We have been betrayed." End quote. On February 2, 1943, the remnants of 6th Army surrendered. Of the 290,000 men encircled, approximately 91,000 were taken prisoner. The rest had died in the fighting or from starvation and exposure. And for those 91,000 prisoners, the ordeal was just beginning. Soviet POW camps were barely functional systems overwhelmed by the numbers. According to statistics compiled by Soviet military historian G.F. Krivoshev of the German prisoners taken at Stalingrad, only about 6,000 survived to return to Germany after the war. Most died in the first months of captivity from typhus, dysentery, starvation, and the lingering effects of months in the Kessel. Stalingrad destroyed an entire army and shattered the myth of German invincibility. But it wasn't the last major German offensive. That came in summer 1943 at Kursk. Operation Citadel was Hitler's attempt to regain the initiative by pinching off the Kursk salient, a bulge in the Soviet lines. The Soviet High Command knew the attack was coming, intelligence was excellent, and prepared defenses in depth, multiple belts of trenches, minefields, anti-tank strongpoints, and reserve formations positioned to counterattack. When the German offensive launched on July 5, 1943, it immediately bogged down. The Wehrmacht was attacking prepared defenses with reduced forces. The easy encirclements of 1941 were no longer possible against an enemy that had learned hard lessons and was fighting on favorable ground. The battle became a brutal slugging match, the largest tank engagement in history with over 6,000 armored vehicles involved. After 2 weeks of horrific casualties and minimal gains, Hitler called off the offensive. For the first time, Germany had launched a major summer offensive and been stopped cold. The strategic initiative passed permanently to the Soviet Union. From Kursk onward, the Wehrmacht would be reacting, retreating, trying desperately to slow an enemy that grew stronger while German strength ebbed. And this brings us to the personnel crisis that would define the German experience for the rest of the war. Modern armies are built on unit cohesion, experienced soldiers who know their comrades and trust their leaders. By late 1943, that cohesion was breaking down. The casualty rates on the Eastern Front consumed trained manpower faster than it could be replaced. According to historian Omer Bartov's research in his book Hitler's Army, German casualties on the Eastern Front from June 1941 through December 1943 totaled approximately 2.2 million killed, wounded, and missing. Units were constantly fed replacements, young men often with only weeks of training, thrown into combat alongside a handful of veterans. This created a vicious cycle. Inexperienced soldiers made mistakes that got them and others killed faster, which meant more replacements were needed, which meant experience levels dropped further. A company commander whose account appears in the academic journal article by Snedden and Guldal analyzing war stories noted. In 1940, my company had men who had trained together for a year. They moved like a machine. By 1944, I receive boys who have fired 20 practice rounds and do not know how to dig a proper trench. They die within a week and I learn not to bother learning their names. The psychological impact of this constant churn was devastating. Soldiers became fatalistic. Unit pride and cohesion, traditional sources of military morale, eroded. Letters home became increasingly bleak. And then there's the moral dimension that we cannot avoid. German soldiers on the Eastern Front were not simply warriors caught in a terrible conflict. They were participants in a criminal war of annihilation. This is not a comfortable truth, and for decades after the war, it was obscured by the myth of the clean Wehrmacht, the false narrative that the regular army fought honorably while atrocities were committed only by the SS. Modern historical scholarship has thoroughly demolished that myth. According to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum's research, Wehrmacht units were directly involved in mass killings from the beginning of the campaign. The Commissar order, issued before Barbarossa began, required the execution of Soviet political officers. Army units carried out these executions. When Einsatzgruppen SS killing squads operated behind the front lines, massacring Jewish civilians, they often received logistical support from Wehrmacht units. Army commanders provided trucks, translators, guards, and in many documented cases, soldiers as shooters. The USHMM documentation includes testimony and records showing that ordinary soldiers participated in or witnessed atrocities. Some participated willingly, motivated by ideological conviction or bloodlust. Some participated under orders, though the historical record shows that soldiers who refused to participate in killings were generally reassigned rather than punished, meaning participation was more often a choice than German soldiers later claimed. And many soldiers witnessed crimes without participating, making them bystanders who did nothing. One sergeant's diary entry from August 1941, preserved in the German History and Documents and Images Archive, describes coming across an Einsatzgruppen action. Quote, "We saw them shoot the Jews into a pit. Women and children. Some of the men were laughing. I felt sick, but I did not say anything. What could I do? We marched on." End quote. This moral complicity existed alongside the soldiers' own suffering. These are not mutually exclusive realities. A man can be starving in a frozen trench at Stalingrad and also be someone who stood by while civilians were murdered. He can write heartbreaking letters home about the horror of combat and be part of an army enforcing genocidal policies. Understanding the experience of German soldiers on the Eastern Front requires holding both truths simultaneously without diminishing either. They suffered terribly, and they served a monstrous cause, and many participated directly in atrocities. As the war ground on, some soldiers began to question the propaganda they had been fed. The letters show this evolution. Early war letters are often confident, even triumphant, accepting the ideological framework. By 1943 and 44, letters show doubt, desperation, and sometimes explicit recognition that the cause was lost and perhaps never just. A teacher-turned-soldier named Walter Berg wrote in early 1944, quoted in the Snedden and Guldal analysis, "We were told we fought for Germany's survival. Now I think we fight only to delay our own destruction. I have seen things I cannot write about. If there is a God, he will judge us harshly." End quote. The psychological burden of combat, what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder but had no proper name for then, compounded with moral injury, the trauma of participating in or witnessing acts that violate one's core values. Soldiers couldn't process these experiences with the frameworks we have today. They had no trauma counseling, no mental health support, just endless combat punctuated by propaganda that insisted their sacrifices served a glorious cause. Many broke, desertion rates climbed, though deserters faced execution. Self-inflicted wounds became common enough that commanders issued threats of investigation. Combat effectiveness declined not just from inexperience, but from soldiers who no longer believed in anything except survival. By 1944, the Eastern Front had become a catastrophe in slow motion for Germany. Operation Bagration, the Soviet summer offensive of 1944, demonstrated how completely the tables had turned. Launched on June 23, 1944, 3 years and 1 day after Barbarossa, Bagration targeted Army Group Center in Belarus. The Soviets had learned to execute the very encirclement operations the Germans had pioneered. Using deception, overwhelming artillery bombardments, and coordinated armor and infantry assaults, the Red Army tore through German lines. In 5 weeks, Army Group Center was destroyed. According to Soviet and German sources analyzed by historian David Glantz, German losses totaled approximately 400,000 men killed or captured, 28 divisions effectively destroyed. It was a greater disaster than Stalingrad in scale, though less well known in popular history. The Wehrmacht was in full retreat across the Eastern Front. By August 1944, Soviet forces reached the pre-war Polish border. For German soldiers, retreat was a chaotic nightmare. Supply lines collapsed. Units fragmented. Soldiers walked hundreds of miles trying to reach German lines, scrounging food from abandoned farms, dodging Soviet patrols and partisan ambushes. Letters from this period, when they exist at all, speak of total chaos. A corporal with the 441st Infantry Regiment wrote in July 1944, "We have been walking for 11 days. I began with 40 men. I now have 6. I do not know where the front is. We see German corpses hanging from trees where partisans have caught them. We hide during the day and walk at night. I do not think we will make it home." This letter, preserved in the Futsch compilation, was one of the last the man ever sent. As Soviet forces advanced into German-held territory, the treatment of German soldiers who were captured or surrendered became a matter of survival. The Red Army had not forgotten how Germans treated Soviet prisoners in 1941 and 42, when millions of Soviet POWs were deliberately starved to death or worked to death in camps. According to Krivashev's statistical analysis, approximately 3 million German soldiers were taken prisoner by Soviet forces during the war. Of those, roughly 1 million died in captivity. The mortality rate, 33%, was catastrophic but notably lower than the nearly 60% mortality rate for Soviet prisoners in German hands. Soviet camps were harsh, plagued by disease, food shortages, and brutal labor conditions, but they were not extermination camps. Survival was possible if one endured and had luck. Prisoners were used as labor to rebuild the Soviet Union they had helped destroy, working in mines, factories, construction. Repatriation began in 1945 but continued slowly for years. The last German prisoners didn't return from Soviet camps until 1956, over a decade after the war ended. For those who survived, returning to Germany meant confronting a country that had been physically destroyed and psychologically devastated. The Germany they had left no longer existed. Cities were rubble. The Nazi state had collapsed. The full scope of the Holocaust was becoming public knowledge through the Nuremberg trials, and many veterans carried injuries visible and invisible. Amputees missing limbs from frostbite or shrapnel were common sights. Less visible were the men who couldn't sleep, who startled at loud noises, who drank to forget, who couldn't form relationships because they had learned not to get close to people who would die. The academic literature on post-war German veterans, including work by historians like Robert Moeller, documents how difficult reintegration was. West German society wanted to move on, to rebuild and forget. The narrative of the clean Wehrmacht became comforting because it allowed veterans to see themselves as honorable soldiers rather than participants in atrocity. East German society took a different approach, officially blaming fascism as an ideology while often quietly integrating former Wehrmacht soldiers into society and even the new East German military. But private accounts tell a different story of men haunted by what they did and saw. A veteran interviewed in the 1980s for an oral history project stated, "I am 80 years old. I still dream about the Eastern Front 3 nights a week. I see the faces of the Russian prisoners we marched past, starving. I see the village we burned in 1943. My grandson asks me about the war. I tell him I was just a soldier, but I know better. We all knew better." The legacy of the Eastern Front remains contested. In some narratives, German soldiers are portrayed primarily as victims, suffering for a cause they didn't choose, enduring unimaginable hardship. This narrative contains truth, but it's incomplete and can veer into apologism if it erases German crimes. In other narratives, Wehrmacht soldiers are portrayed as willing executioners, enthusiastic Nazis implementing genocide. This narrative also contains truth, but can flatten the complexity of individual experience and motivation. The most accurate understanding requires holding multiple truths simultaneously. Wehrmacht soldiers invaded a foreign country in a war of annihilation premised on racist ideology. They participated in or enabled war crimes on a massive scale. The suffering of millions of Soviet civilians and prisoners of war was directly caused by German policy and actions. At the same time, individual German soldiers experienced genuine hardship, terror, trauma, and many near the end recognized the criminal nature of the regime they served. They were both perpetrators and victims, sometimes of each other and their own leadership's catastrophic decisions. Their suffering does not erase their complicity. Their complicity does not mean their suffering was insignificant. This is the moral complexity we must confront. So how do we answer the central question? How did the Wehrmacht go from invincible propaganda to frozen attritional collapse? The military answer is straightforward. Catastrophic leadership failures at the highest levels. Hitler's ideological obsessions overrode strategic sense. The invasion plan assumed victory in weeks without serious consideration of what would happen if the Soviet Union didn't collapse. Logistics were neglected. Intelligence underestimated Soviet reserves and production capacity. Tactical victories in encirclements didn't translate to strategic victory because the Soviet state never broke, and Stalin, unlike leaders in France or Poland, was willing to accept staggering losses and continue fighting. The decision to divert forces to Kiev in September 1940 delayed the Moscow offensive until winter. The refusal to allow tactical retreats meant armies were encircled and destroyed when they could have withdrawn to fight another day. The logistical answer compounds this. The Wehrmacht's supply system couldn't support operations at the depth required. Rasputitsa and winter Then equipment and transportation failures compounded by insufficient preparation made it impossible to sustain offensive operations. By the time German forces reached the outskirts of Moscow, they were exhausted, undersupplied, and facing an enemy that was finally getting organized. The environmental answer is that Russia's geography and climate were weapons in themselves. The vast distances consumed German strength. The primitive infrastructure made resupply nearly impossible. The winter cold disabled equipment and killed men faster than combat. And the human answer is attrition. Germany simply didn't have enough men to sustain the casualty rates the Eastern Front demanded. Every experienced soldier killed was replaced by a less experienced one. Unit cohesion collapsed. Morale, sustained initially by propaganda and early victories, couldn't survive years of relentless grinding combat and retreat. But there's also the moral answer. The criminal nature of the war meant the Wehrmacht was fighting not just the Red Army, but the entire Soviet population. Partisan warfare erupted because German occupation policy was genocidal. Villages were burned, civilians were massacred, populations were starved. This guaranteed that there could be no stable rear area, no friendly population, only hostile territory where every supply convoy was vulnerable. The Wehrmacht created the conditions for its own strategic defeat by waging a war of annihilation. A conventional war for limited objectives might have been winnable, or at least fightable to a stalemate. A war that aimed to exterminate entire populations guaranteed total resistance and total war. And what did the men experience? They experienced the collapse of every certainty they'd been given. They were told they were superior and would win quickly. Instead, they fought for years and lost. They were told their cause was righteous. Instead, they participated in or witnessed atrocities that haunted them. They were told their leadership was competent. Instead, they were marched into disasters like Stalingrad and abandoned. They experienced physical extremes that broke bodies and minds, cold that froze flesh solid, hunger that reduced men to fighting over scraps, fear that became so constant it was just the background of existence. They experienced the betrayal of watching friends die for objectives that were abandoned days later, of being promised relief that never came, of being ordered to hold positions that were indefensible. And they experienced, at least some of them, moral reckoning, the recognition that they had served evil. Not all felt this. Some maintained their Nazi convictions to the grave. But the letters and diaries show that many came to understand, if only dimly, the nature of what they had done. Why does this matter today? First, because historical accuracy matters. The myth of the clean Wehrmacht has been used to rehabilitate German militarism and minimize the Wehrmacht's role in Nazi crimes. Combating that myth with evidence is essential to preventing historical revisionism. Second, because understanding how ordinary people become participants in atrocity is crucial for recognizing warning signs in our own time. The German soldiers who invaded the Soviet Union were not monsters from birth. They were products of a society that had been propagandized, militarized, and taught to dehumanize others. How that happens is a preventable process if we recognize it. Third, because the experience of the Eastern Front shaped Cold War Europe. The trauma in both Soviet and German societies influenced decades of political and social development. The Soviet Union's determination never to allow another invasion from the West drove its creation of a buffer zone in Eastern Europe. German collective memory of the Eastern Front shaped post-war pacifism and complicated reckoning with Nazi crimes. Understanding that history explains the present. And finally, because the human capacity for both endurance and cruelty, often in the same person, is something every generation must reckon with. The soldiers who fought on the Eastern Front were not aliens. They were humans placed in extreme circumstances by catastrophic leadership serving a genocidal ideology. Some resisted, most complied, many participated enthusiastically. Their letters show love for families, fear of death, exhaustion, doubt, cruelty, tenderness, all the contradictions that humans contain. We study their experience not to excuse it, but to understand how the combination of ideology, propaganda, military culture, and war's dehumanizing pressure can lead to atrocity while individuals still see themselves as doing their duty. So what was the biggest factor in the Wehrmacht's collapse on the Eastern Front? Was it combat, the skill and resilience of the Red Army? Was it the cold, the winters that froze armies in place? Or was it leadership failure, the strategic incompetence and ideological obsessions of Hitler and the High Command? The historical evidence suggests it was all three, interacting in ways that made collapse inevitable. But if we must identify the single most important factor, it was leadership failure. Combat was brutal, but the Wehrmacht proved it could fight effectively even at a tactical disadvantage. The cold was devastating, but proper preparation could have mitigated it. What couldn't be overcome was strategic leadership that prioritized ideology over reality, that refused to acknowledge mistakes, that sacrificed armies for symbolic objectives, and that waged a criminal war that guaranteed total enemy resistance. Hitler's decision to invade the Soviet Union without adequate preparation, his refusal to allow strategic retreats, his diversion of forces to secondary objectives, and his insistence on holding untenable positions destroyed his own armies as surely as Soviet bullets and winter cold. This documentary has drawn on primary sources from the German history, in documents and images archive maintained by the German Historical Institute. The letters from the Eastern Front compilation published by Warfare History Network. Research from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum on Wehrmacht complicity in the Holocaust. Analysis from the National World War II Museum on battles like Stalingrad. The historical work of Antony Beevor, particularly his definitive account of Stalingrad. The statistical analysis of Soviet casualties and German prisoners by historian G. F. Krivoshev. The academic scholarship of historians like Omer Bartov and David Stahel on Wehrmacht combat effectiveness and operational history, and the literary analysis of war narratives by scholars including Snedden and Guldal. These sources allow us to construct a picture grounded in evidence, using the words of participants and the analysis of experts to understand what happened and why. The men who fought on the Eastern Front left us their testimony in thousands of letters and diaries. They tell us that war at that scale and intensity breaks human beings. They tell us that suffering and guilt can coexist. They tell us that propaganda collapses when it meets reality, but the collapse comes too late to save the people who believed it. For the students, teachers, and history enthusiasts watching this, the invitation is to continue exploring these sources yourselves. Read the letters, study the scholarship, confront the uncomfortable moral questions. History isn't about simple narratives of heroes and villains. It's about understanding how humans behave under pressure, how societies can descend into atrocity, how individuals navigate impossible choices, and how the consequences of those choices echo across generations. The Eastern Front was the largest and most brutal theater of the deadliest war in human history. Over 30 million people, military and civilian, died in that conflict on the Soviet side alone. Several million Germans died. Entire cities were erased. And in the midst of that industrial-scale slaughter, the Holocaust was perpetrated, a genocide enabled by the very military campaigns we've examined. Understanding that history fully, with all its moral complexity and human tragedy, is how